Okay, you can see we have Pro Tools open, and within Pro Tools, we also have StudioRack open for us to see. Before we dive into the details of StudioRack and what makes it pretty awesome, let's take a step back and review. And first of all, answer the question, well, what is StudioRack? Well, StudioRack allows you to build intricate chains of up to 8 plugins from just one DAW insert and save them for instant recall. As you can see, we've got our plugins here within StudioRack, and on this track Vox Tune, we have just one instance of StudioRack. So within here, we have so many possibilities that in your DAW is just one plugin insert. While StudioRack isn't a new plugin itself, this is a new version that has many enhanced features, including parallel processing racks, multi-band split racks, and quick access macros to create your own custom plugins. Just like our Signature Series plugins, this will now be your own Signature Series plugin. So if you haven't already, how do you go about getting StudioRack? Well, first and foremost, the best part about this is it is completely free. StudioRack, the plugin chainer, is available to you absolutely for free. Now, how do you get it? Well, two different ways. You can get it within SoundGrid Studio, which is also free. The 8-channel version is free, and it's part of that once you download that. Or, of course, you can just download StudioRack for free by itself. Now, how do we do that? You will go to waves.com, log into your account, and once you go to your My Account page, you'll see right here in the center the free stuff section. You have StudioRack for free, SoundGrid Studio for free, whichever one you want, or both. You can download by clicking the link, and you'll see Get StudioRack for free. Once you click that link, it will register a code, an activation code to your account. From there, you go onto your Wave Central application, activate it, install it just like you would any other Waves plugin. So that's how you get it absolutely for free. Now that we've gone over how you get StudioRack, the brief details of what it is, let's take a tour of this new graphic interface. As you can see right here underneath this power button are 8 slots where you can have Waves plugins. And once you create your chain here, you can then save this. Again, that will be one plugin insert in your DAW. So within this graphic interface, of course, you can see this power button, which then essentially bypasses all of these plugins. These blue lights do the same. It's essentially a bypass. Up here on the top left, you have your input, you have your phase reverse, your input gain, your input meter. Over here on the right, you have your output meters, your output gain, your gain reduction. You've got your rack of plugins and your macros here on the left. You also have over here on the left 3 different views to choose from. Right now we're on the all, so we can see our macros and our rack. You can also toggle between just the rack view and just your macros. This view to me emulates a Signature Series plugin. Much like our Signature Series plugins, you only see a few parameters that you're going to change between. This is your Signature Series plugin that you can create your own macros and only focus on the up to 8 features that you want to, that you can assign to many, many parameters within all the plugins here in your rack, which we'll dive into a little bit later. So now how do you create plugin chains within StudioRack? Well, it's as easy as in the rack here, just adding a plugin. You can select from plugins, you can select splits, or we have a new search feature where you can just type in whatever plugin you're looking for and add it right there. A great new feature within StudioRack is you also do have these floating plugin windows within the StudioRack plugin. So a very cool thing you can do is at the top right here of this VU meter, you can see 2 tabs, 2 buttons, close all and this pin button. If we click this pin button, it will stay there should we want to open another plugin within StudioRack. I'll pin this REQ2. So you can see we have 2 plugins open here. We can add another one. We can add a third. We can pin these. And a really cool feature about StudioRack is if I were to close this instance of StudioRack, and reopen it, those pinned windows would also reopen with it as well. Pretty quick, uh, not pretty quick, pretty cool way if you are moving quick throughout your DAW and you want these things to be at a glance at all times. Very helpful. And if you want to remove these, you don't have to necessarily unpin them one by one or unclose them. You can just hit close all. Very quick and awesome ways to help you streamline your process. Also, a very cool thing here within StudioRack is, as you can see in our rack of up to 8 plugins, 8 inserts, a neat feature is, say you want to swap plugins and your rack's full. Typically in Pro Tools, you aren't able to do this without removing a plugin. You could simply just drag and drop and change the order of these. Absolutely no problem at all. And the great thing about this is, within StudioRack, swapping these plugins, you will have no dropout. A SoundGrid server helps make this possible as well, but that is a great feature if you are wanting to change things on the fly, reorder things without any hiccups in playback and or recording. Another great feature is, say you started this vocal track was a mono track, say you started it as a mono instance of StudioRack. Say you started it with the mono version and you dialed in all these settings and you then decided, oh, hey, I want some stereo reverb. Well, you could then switch between either the mono to stereo version or vice versa in reverse. And all your settings that you have already dialed in within StudioRack, plugin settings, if you got your compressor all dialed in and your macros built, if you switched over to another instance of StudioRack, all those settings then would stay the same. Granted, if you are going from a stereo reverb to mono, that might get a little different, but all the hard work that you've put in will maintain, so you don't have to redo it, replicate it. Again, a lot of time-saving features here within StudioRack. And then once you've dialed in your settings here, you've got your plugins and the settings within the plugins here in StudioRack, your macros and where you want them to live, all of your levels here within your splits. All you simply need to do, we'll do this here together, is just save a preset. So we'll go put into preset menu as, and we'll call this StudioRack demo. Okay, and you'll see already here, it's under the user presets here within StudioRack. Now, you'll notice we're in Pro Tools naturally. So we created that preset, and yes, it's loading here, but say if you're collaborating with others who might use Logic, or you like sequencing in Logic versus Pro Tools and you want to have access to these presets, will they work in other DAWs if you save one in Pro Tools and then you open it up in Logic? Well, yes. And let's just give an example here. You'll see I have a vocal track here in this Logic session and it's soloed. Let's go to StudioRack. We'll make it mono to stereo. StudioRack will load at the grace of my computer. And let's see, we'll go to load and you'll notice right there under user presets, StudioRack demo, the preset we just created with our chain or macros. You'll see the exact same thing all here, much like in Pro Tools, also here in Logic. All right, so yes, StudioRack works in many DAWs. The presets you build will then work across all of those DAWs. Now, of course, the new features within StudioRack, we've got multi-band splits and parallel processing racks here within StudioRack. So how do we take advantage of these? Well, let's first talk about the multi-band split. You can add as many bands as you need, up to 5, simply by clicking the plus or minus here. Let's go all the way up to 5, and you'll see the plus goes away. Now, you'll also notice here, we've got our different bands, and you have full control of your crossover frequencies. This one's set at 4,000. We can just simply change this to whatever we want. You can disable these by turning them off. You again have your phase reverse, input gain, and another rack of up to 8 inserts, 8 plugins here, which check this out. You then could, if you wanted to, add another multiband split or another parallel split here within this band, or just 8 plugins. You have your solo, your left, right, and your fader here for the level of this band that you want. So pretty cool within multi-band splits, very, very powerful. And much like any of these plugins, you could then just drag this wherever you wanted in the chain. Again, remember, with no dropout. Now let's talk about parallel splits. You can add up to, look at that, up to 8 parallel splits within one of these splits. And much like our multiband splits, you on each rack here, on each split, you have another 8 inserts where you can add any plugin you want here. You can add another parallel split if you want to get crazy. You can add another multiband split within this parallel split. How do parallel splits work? Well, of course, you have your options here: left, right, mid, sides, stereo. So you can get really crazy here with mid side work. You have your phase reverse, your input gain, the same way you do here. As you can see in this example here, these of course are not active, they're turned off, but you'll see this first rack here, this first lane, there's no plugins, there's no inserts here. Think of parallel splits, that's essentially your pass through, our dry signal that's going down the chain and not being affected. We could put stuff here if we wanted to, but that's like our dry signal. Anything that happened above the parallel split is going to pass through afterwards. And then these are the parallel processing. You can see we've got parallel compression here with the MV2, and then we have reverb, and then you have control over that, essentially your reverb return with these faders. You can solo, hear how that sounds. Now, a very cool feature within our parallel splits, you'll notice the pan here, the left right, is a little bit different than the multiband split. You see this blue part above it, and you see this W. So what is that? Well, yes, you have your pan left and right, but this blue is also an S1 stereo imager built within the parallel split. So you don't have to add this plugin here within this rack. You just drag that off, cool feature. But this width feature, you can drag it and make it wider. You can inverse that, and then you can grab the blue here and move your sound field. A very handy feature and very cool feature within these parallel splits that, again, is just built right in here. That same technology within the S1 is here within these parallel splits. Pretty cool and pretty powerful, if you ask me. And as I mentioned before, yeah, you can get super crazy and add another parallel split within this parallel split. You can add another multiband split within a parallel split. You can get very crazy, very creative. And the way that our splits work is after this split, then whatever happens afterwards here on our initial rack of 8 would then affect everything above it. So think of it top down. Everything after the multi-band split is going through Vitamin. Everything after the parallel split is going through this VU meter, so we can see it here. Okay, now how do we make the most creative use of StudioRack's new macros? Well, this is how our Artist Signature series work. Now you can create your own signature plugins. You can assign macros in 3 different ways. First, you can right-click a macro and select the parameter that you want it to adjust. Or within any plugin, you can simply right-click any parameter and assign it to any one of your macros. Or the third way is you can just click the Assign button here. These will flash, select it, and then select the parameter within a plugin that you want to link it to, much like you would a MIDI learn feature. So that's how you assign your macros. And these macros then would control, again, any parameter that you want it to. So let's take a look at an example here. So open this de-esser here. We'll bring it down here so we can see it and move StudioRack out of the way. All right, so what happens when we move this DS macro? We'll see what it's linked to here in the de-esser plugin. You'll notice as I raise the DS macro, our threshold, as I raise the macro, the threshold goes down. And then after about halfway on the macro, the range starts to kick in as well. So you can see a good example here as I start to lower the macro, the range and the threshold start to raise. But once I get about halfway, only the threshold is affected and not the range. And again, once I get to about halfway, then the range is also affected. So this is a good example of how one macro can control multiple parameters in very customizable ways. Again, they're not exactly linked where threshold and range are moving at the exact same time forever. You can see how once the macro reached about halfway, only then the range would kick in. And how do we go about editing these macros in these ways? Well, the edit button, of course, and you can see all the macros that you have here: color press, gate, presence, RDS, the plugin, the macro we are just affecting, this DS, you can see it assigned to 3 different parameters, 2 of which in the Renaissance de-esser that we were just looking at, the threshold and the range. And you can see here how this range only again affects once we get about halfway through the macros adjusting abilities, and the threshold all the way. You can also see the de-esser affects the C4 and its band 4 range. And again, you can select these minimum ranges, these maximum ranges. If you hit this button here, it'll inverse it. So if you were to raise the macro, instead of going one way, it would flip it and go the other way. Again, like if you want to have on compressors, your input and output, and you want them linked, but you don't want them going the exact same way, you want them going inverse, that's how you would then control that. So let's take a look here. Let's open up this C4. Again, we can pin our de-esser, go to the C4, we'll pin this guy, and we'll adjust the de-esser, and you'll see the threshold, the range in the Renaissance de-esser, and this 4th band here on the C4 adjust, increase the range. So that's a quick glance at how you have extreme flexibility in assigning, controlling the parameters within your macros. Now, that's pretty much the gist of our inserts, our macros here within StudioRack. Now, as we talked about before, we talked about SoundGrid Studio. That's how you can also get StudioRack for free as well within SoundGrid Studio, comes along with it. So with that being said, StudioRack, yes, of course, is compatible with SoundGrid Studio, giving you 2 options. One, the option to offload all plugin processing to a SoundGrid server in order to mix plugin-rich sessions unlimited by your computer CPU. That's one option. And or for extreme low latency monitoring through plugins during recording and playback. So let's talk about the first of which, offloading your plugin processing to a SoundGrid server. This, of course, means you would need a SoundGrid server. Now, do you need a SoundGrid audio interface? No, not necessarily for this option. All you need is a SoundGrid server. You can see these parameters right here in the top left of StudioRack. This green SG means I'm connected to a server. How you switch between these are switch to native would then be your computer's local CPU. Switch all to SG means you're going via SoundGrid to your server. This is our meter showing us the DSP load of our SoundGrid server. How this is set up within SoundGrid Studio, you assign your computer as the SoundGrid driver and your server here. If you don't have a SoundGrid interface, which you can see right here, you can use any third-party interface through the SG Connect assignment found here. So that's how briefly you would use a server to offload processing through StudioRack to a server to free your computer CPU for anything else, speed up the process, help your computer out. For more information on SoundGrid Studio, much like this webinar, I also host webinars on SoundGrid Studio, where you can find a list of those times, much like you did for this one. You'll go to waves.com, learn events, intro to SoundGrid Studio online webinars. From here, you'll see a list of the dates and the times that are still available, and you'll register. And then you can join me again as we talk about SoundGrid Studio and the benefits and how that will help you in your workflow there. Now, one other quick feature before I open this up to questions from you. As I mentioned, the second benefit to StudioRack after offloading processing to a server is enabling you to record, monitor, playback your processing, these plugins, in real time with extreme low latency. How do we do that? How do you set that up? Well, this is then where you would need a SoundGrid compatible audio interface. You can see that's assigned here. I have a DigiGrid D assigned to my I/O devices here within SoundGrid Studio, my computer, my server. This is how we know and can calculate latency with the interfaces that we know are compatible with our networking protocol. First and foremost, you want to make sure within your DAW, your playback engine is set to Waves SoundGrid. And from there, you, much like I showed you, you want to have your SoundGrid Studio set up and configured with all the assets that you need. Again, your SoundGrid interface, your host computer linked, and your server. From here, we would want to do a couple of steps. You'll notice to the right of our SoundGrid feature here, you have this which says none. This is where you assign an input. So if we were recording a vocalist here, this is the input that you would choose it from. Right now, you'll see this PB turn to green. That stands for playback. Now, a really cool feature within StudioRack is, say you're recording and you want your vocalist to hear the processing in their headphones, but then when we stop recording and we play back, we still want to hear that processing as well. How do we switch between that? Well, you can switch between that, yes. That could be cumbersome. There is a very quick and easy feature within StudioRack where it can automatically adjust depending whether you're recording, playing back, and I'll show you how to do that quickly before we dive into questions. Much like you would set up a controller, you'll go to Peripherals, MIDI Controllers, Huey, SoundGrid StudioRack, SoundGrid StudioRack. And before we hit record, you'll notice this green PB, again, standing for playback. What we'll do, yes, that's in playback mode. We can switch between playback and input, or we can switch it to auto. So now, right now we're on input. So our vocalist now would be hearing input. So she'd be hearing her voice with this processing. Now we want to punch record. So we're going to start the track early on so she can get the vibe. The vocalist can get the vibe. We'll hear the track. She'll still hear her processing. And then when we hit record, it'll switch into, check it out. I'll just show you. You'll see how I hit play. It switched from input to playback automatically. Now I'm going to hit record. It switched to input automatically. And I'm going to punch out. And it went back to playback. And then I stopped and we're back to input, all automatically. Pretty cool, pretty helpful. Again, all this is happening, extreme low latency. Again, thanks to SoundGrid interface and a server all within StudioRack here in your DAW. So as you can see, there are endless possibilities of creative freedom waiting for you within StudioRack.